Well, I've suddenly got rid of my self-doubt and my, well, it's still there, but I've got more control over it. And so now I find everything seriously joyful. Isn't joyful a good name? It's a good word.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
I mean, we should all be so lucky.
The Duchess of York's career just exploded in the most devastating way possible. Sarah Ferguson has been brutally axed from ITV, and what they discovered will leave you absolutely speechless. This isn't just a career setback. This is complete and utter destruction. Sources reveal she's been cut off entirely, with network bosses making it crystal clear she's done. Forever. For those who may not be familiar with Sarah Ferguson's recent television work, she has become a fairly regular presence on ITV over the past several years.
Children so much, and she was always funny and always witty and so compassionate. But she's not really gone anywhere, because she and I were locked at the hip. She was my sister-in-law, and she's the only one who knew exactly how it was. I mean, she brought me into the royal family.
Right.
And so she's just will always be, not just anything, she'll always be in my heart.
She appeared on This Morning, one of Britain's most popular daytime television programs, where she took on roles both as a guest presenter and as a contributor discussing various topics. Additionally, she was a familiar face on Loose Women, the long-running panel show where she shared personal stories and offered her perspective on current events. Her appearances were generally well received by audiences who seemed to appreciate her candid approach and willingness to discuss her life experiences openly. The decision by ITV to cut all ties with Ferguson comes in the wake of her connection to the Jeffrey Epstein scandal, which has already had devastating consequences for her ex-husband, Prince Andrew. Epstein, for those who need context, was a financier who was convicted of serious crimes involving the exploitation of minors and died in prison in 2019 while awaiting trial on additional charges. His associations with numerous high-profile figures, including members of the British royal family, have been the subject of intense scrutiny and ongoing investigations for years. According to a report published by the Daily Mail, sources within ITV have confirmed that the 66-year-old Duchess will not be returning to any of their programs. One source was quoted as saying there is nothing in the pipeline for Ferguson, and that essentially, all professional ties between her and the channel have been severed. The language used was quite direct, with the source stating that Ferguson is done with the channel, emphasizing that this applies to both current plans and any potential future collaborations. This represents a dramatic reversal of fortune for Ferguson, who had been working steadily to rebuild her public image and career over recent years. For a time, she was actually considered something of a valuable asset to ITV, bringing in solid ratings and offering viewers a unique perspective as someone with insider knowledge of royal life. Her media presence had extended beyond just television appearances as well. She had successfully established herself as an author, writing both children's books and memoirs that found commercial success. She had become an advocate for various charitable causes and had managed to cultivate a public persona that many found engaging and relatable. The timing of this decision is particularly significant. Ferguson had spent years carefully rebuilding her reputation after enduring various scandals and financial difficulties that had kept her largely on the outside of royal circles for an extended period. Her return to television represented a kind of professional redemption, a sign that she had managed to move past her troubled history and find a new role for herself in public life. ITV's decision to give her a platform was seen by many as an endorsement of this rehabilitation. Now, however, all of that progress appears to have been wiped away almost overnight. The entertainment industry can be unforgiving when controversies arise, and networks are typically quick to distance themselves from figures who become associated with scandal, particularly when those scandals involve serious criminal matters. ITV's decision reflects a calculation that whatever value Ferguson brought to their programming is outweighed by the potential damage to the network's reputation from continuing to work with her. The catalyst for this dramatic change in Ferguson's professional circumstances was the emergence of communications between her and Jeffrey Epstein that paint a troubling picture of their relationship. The Mail on Sunday reported that they had uncovered an email from 2011 inches, which Ferguson wrote to Epstein in terms that many have found deeply problematic given what was already known about him at that time. In this email, Ferguson reportedly described Epstein as someone who had always been a steadfast, generous, and supreme friend to both her and her family. She appeared to be apologizing to him for having publicly distanced herself from him in media interviews. The significance of this cannot be overstated. By 2011, Epstein had already been convicted of crimes involving a minor. His 2008 conviction was a matter of public record, widely reported in the media. There was no ambiguity about who Epstein was or what he had done. What makes this particularly difficult to reconcile is that just weeks before sending that email, Ferguson had given an interview in which she publicly characterized her association with Epstein as a gigantic error of judgment. She had, in other words, acknowledged publicly that her connection to him was a mistake, yet privately, she was apparently writing to him in warm, appreciative terms and apologizing for having made those public statements. This disconnect between her public and private communications has become a central focus of the criticism now being directed at Ferguson. It suggests a level of duplicity that many find unacceptable, particularly given the serious nature of Epstein's crimes and the harm caused to his victims. The fact that she felt compelled to apologize to a convicted offender for publicly distancing herself from him raises serious questions about her judgment and her priorities at that time. The discovery of this email has prompted a wave of public criticism, not just from media commentators, but from Ferguson's former colleagues as well. Jane Moore, one of the panelists on Loose Women, delivered a particularly harsh assessment of Ferguson's behavior during a recent episode of the show. Moore suggested that Ferguson's combination of naivety and attraction to a luxurious lifestyle has consistently made her vulnerable to poor decisions. More pointedly, Moore argued that Ferguson's apparent attempt to maintain good relations with Epstein, despite his conviction, was not simply a minor character flaw or a forgivable mistake, but rather demonstrated what Moore described as craven greed and self-preservation at the expense of consideration for Epstein's victims. These are strong words, particularly coming from someone who had worked alongside Ferguson in a professional capacity. The fact that her former colleagues are willing to criticize her so openly on air speaks to the severity with which many people view her actions. It also reflects a broader public sentiment that Ferguson's behavior represents something more than just a lapse in judgment. For many observers, it suggests a fundamental moral failing, a willingness to overlook serious crimes when it served her personal interests. The situation has effectively ended what had been a successful phase of Ferguson's career in media and entertainment. ITV's decision is unlikely to be reversed, and other broadcasters will almost certainly be watching closely and drawing their own conclusions about the risks of working with her. In an industry where public image is everything, association with the Epstein scandal carries enormous potential for reputational damage. Understanding the full scope of this situation requires looking more closely at the timeline of events and the financial relationship that apparently existed between Sarah Ferguson and Jeffrey Epstein. The circumstances surrounding their connection reveal a pattern of behavior that goes beyond a simple error in judgment and suggests a more calculated approach to maintaining beneficial relationships, even when those relationships carried significant moral and reputational costs. The email that has caused so much controversy was not an isolated incident or a momentary lapse. It was part of a broader pattern of interaction between Ferguson and Epstein that continued even after his criminal conviction became public knowledge. According to reports, Epstein had provided financial assistance to Ferguson in 2010, allegedly paying £15,000 to help settle some of her debts. This was not ancient history when Epstein committed some unknown offense. This was 2 years after his conviction, at a time when anyone paying attention to news coverage would have been fully aware of the nature of his crimes. The financial arrangement adds a crucial layer of context to the 2011 email. Ferguson was not simply maintaining a friendship with Epstein out of loyalty, or because she found it difficult to cut ties with someone she had known for years. There was an active financial relationship that apparently made her feel indebted to him. The £15,000, while perhaps not an enormous sum by the standards of wealthy individuals, was clearly significant enough to Ferguson that she felt compelled to express gratitude for it. This raises uncomfortable questions about what Ferguson was willing to overlook or excuse in exchange for financial help. Her debts at that time were well documented. She had struggled with money management for years, a fact that had been the subject of media coverage and public discussion. The toe-sucking scandal of 1992, which involved her financial advisor, was just one example of how her personal financial situation and questionable judgment had previously intersected to create public embarrassment. Throughout the 1992s and into the 2000s, Ferguson faced ongoing financial difficulties that kept her in a precarious position. In that context, Epstein's willingness to help pay her debts would have been extremely valuable to her. But accepting that money came with implications that Ferguson either did not consider or chose to ignore. By taking financial assistance from Epstein after his conviction, she was in effect benefiting from a relationship with a convicted sex offender. And then, by writing to thank him and apologize for publicly distancing herself from him, she was signaling that she valued his financial support more than she valued taking a clear moral stand against his crimes. The content of the email itself is worth examining in detail. According to the reports from the Mail on Sunday, Ferguson wrote to Epstein describing him as a steadfast, generous, and supreme friend. These are not casual or neutral terms. They represent a significant level of praise and appreciation. The word steadfast suggests reliability and loyalty. Generous obviously refers to his financial assistance. Supreme is perhaps the most telling word, suggesting that Epstein held a position of particular importance in her estimation of her friends and supporters. The fact that she felt the need to apologize to him for publicly criticizing their relationship adds another troubling dimension. It suggests that Ferguson was more concerned about maintaining Epstein's goodwill and potentially his continued financial support than she was about the public perception of her judgment or, more importantly, about the impact her words might have on his victims. An apology to Epstein for distancing herself from him implies that she regretted having made those public statements, not because they were untrue, but because they had apparently upset or offended him. This creates a stark contrast between Ferguson's public persona and her private actions. In public, she was willing to acknowledge that her association with Epstein had been a mistake. She used the phrase "gigantic error of judgment," which suggests she understood the severity of the problem and recognized that she should not have maintained ties with him. These public statements would have been carefully considered, likely with input from advisors who understood the importance of Ferguson distancing herself from Epstein for the sake of her own reputation and her standing with the royal family. But in private, she was telling Epstein something entirely different. She was reassuring him that despite what she had said publicly, she still valued their friendship and appreciated everything he had done for her. This kind of duplicity is difficult to explain away or excuse. It was not a case of someone making contradictory statements years apart as their understanding evolved. These were nearly simultaneous communications, one public and one private, that conveyed completely opposite messages about her true feelings and allegiances. The hypocrisy inherent in this behavior has been a focal point of the criticism Ferguson has faced. Many commentators have noted that if she genuinely believed her relationship with Epstein was an error in judgment, she would not have been privately apologizing to him for saying so. Conversely, if she genuinely valued his friendship and support, she should have been honest about that publicly, whatever the consequences might have been for her reputation. The attempt to have it both ways, to publicly condemn the relationship while privately maintaining it, strikes many observers as fundamentally dishonest. From a broader perspective, this situation also raises questions about Ferguson's understanding of what Epstein's crimes actually meant. His conviction was not for some minor financial impropriety or a victimless offense. It involved the exploitation of a minor, a crime that causes profound and lasting harm. The victims of such crimes often struggle for years or even their entire lives with the psychological and emotional damage inflicted upon them. For Ferguson to have accepted money from Epstein after his conviction, and then to have written to him in such warm terms, suggests either a failure to fully comprehend the severity of what he had done, or a willingness to set that knowledge aside when it was financially convenient for her to do so. The public reaction to these revelations has been swift and largely negative. Beyond the institutional response from ITV, individual commentators and members of the public have expressed anger and disappointment at Ferguson's behavior. The criticism from Jane Moore on Loose Women was particularly significant because it came from someone who had worked with Ferguson and presumably had some personal knowledge of her character. Moore's assessment that Ferguson's actions represented craven greed and self-preservation, rather than a forgivable human weakness, resonated with many people who felt that Ferguson deserved to be held accountable for choices that seemed to prioritize her own financial interests over basic moral principles. The phrase that Moore used about Ferguson betraying Epstein's victims is especially powerful. It captures what many people see as the real harm in Ferguson's behavior. By maintaining her relationship with Epstein, accepting his money, and privately expressing gratitude to him while only distancing herself publicly when it became necessary for her reputation, Ferguson was in effect minimizing the seriousness of his crimes. She was treating him as though he was simply someone who had made a mistake that could be overlooked, rather than as someone who had caused real harm to real people. For the victims of Epstein and others like him, seeing public figures continue to associate with their abuser, accept benefits from him, and speak warmly of him must be deeply painful. It sends a message that their suffering is less important than the maintenance of social and financial relationships among the wealthy and powerful. Ferguson's behavior, as revealed in these emails and financial arrangements, contributes to a culture in which powerful men can commit serious crimes and still retain the loyalty and support of their social circles, as long as they continue to be financially generous. The current controversy surrounding Sarah Ferguson is not happening in isolation. To fully understand why this scandal has proven so damaging and why institutions like ITV have responded so decisively, it's necessary to consider the broader context of Ferguson's history and her long, complicated relationship with public scrutiny. Her journey from being a beloved member of the royal family to someone now considered toxic by major broadcasters is a story that spans more than 3 decades and involves multiple scandals, financial crises, and attempts at reinvention. Sarah Ferguson married Prince Andrew in 1986, and for a time, she was one of the most popular members of the royal family. The public seemed to genuinely warm to her approachable personality and her apparent lack of pretension. She was seen as bringing a breath of fresh air to the often stuffy world of royal protocol. However, that popularity began to deteriorate in the early 1992s, as her personal life became the subject of intense media scrutiny and a series of embarrassing revelations. The most infamous incident occurred in 1992, when photographs were published showing Ferguson having her toes sucked by her financial advisor, John Bryan, while on holiday in the south of France. The images were splashed across tabloid newspapers around the world and caused an enormous scandal. What made the situation even more problematic was that while Ferguson and Prince Andrew had already separated by that point, the separation had not yet been formally announced. The photographs appeared to confirm that Ferguson had been involved with Bryan while still technically married to Andrew. Beyond the personal embarrassment, the incident also highlighted Ferguson's financial situation. The fact that her financial advisor was also apparently her romantic partner raised questions about the nature of their relationship and whether there were conflicts of interest in how he was managing her money. In the years that followed, it became clear that Ferguson had accumulated substantial debts. Various reports put the figure in the millions of pounds, though exact amounts have always been difficult to verify. The financial problems were not simply a matter of overspending on personal luxuries. Though that was certainly part of the picture, Ferguson had attempted to maintain a lifestyle appropriate to her royal status even as her income did not support it. She had business ventures that failed to generate the returns she had hoped for. She made investments that did not pay off. The combination of high expenses, failed business ventures, and apparently poor financial management left her in a precarious position for many years. These financial difficulties had real consequences for Ferguson's standing within the royal family. She was increasingly excluded from official royal events and family gatherings. While she maintained a relationship with Prince Andrew and remained close to their 2 daughters, Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, her position on the periphery of royal life became more and more pronounced. There were periods when she was barely mentioned in connection with the family at all, as if the royals were hoping that by ignoring her, the various scandals and embarrassments might fade from public memory. Throughout the late 1992s and the 2000s, Ferguson made various attempts to rebuild her career and her reputation. She moved to the United States for a period, where she worked as a spokesperson for Weight Watchers, a role that brought her some income and kept her in the public eye. She wrote books, including both memoirs and children's literature. Some of these ventures were reasonably successful, though none of them seemed to fully resolve her financial situation or restore her to the kind of comfortable position she had once enjoyed. What made her eventual comeback in recent years so notable was that it seemed, for a time, to represent a genuine turning point. Ferguson had managed to cultivate a new public image as someone who had learned from her mistakes and was now focused on charitable work and creative projects. Her appearances on programs like This Morning and Loose Women were generally well received. She came across as self-deprecating and willing to acknowledge her past errors, which many viewers found endearing. There was a sense that she had paid her dues, so to speak, and deserved a second chance. The irony, of course, is that even as Ferguson was rebuilding this new reputation, her connection to Jeffrey Epstein was already part of her history. The financial assistance Epstein provided in 2010 and the email she sent in 2011 occurred during this same period, when she was supposedly learning from past mistakes and making better choices. The fact that she was simultaneously accepting money from a convicted sex offender and privately expressing gratitude to him, all while publicly presenting herself as someone who had turned over a new leaf, makes her recent media success feel somewhat hollow in retrospect. The response from her former colleagues at Loose Women has been particularly striking because it represents a very public repudiation from people who had worked alongside her and presumably knew her reasonably well. Jane Moore's comments were not the only criticism from the show's panelists, though they were perhaps the most forcefully stated. The willingness of these women to criticize Ferguson on air suggests that they feel her actions were serious enough to warrant public condemnation, even at the risk of appearing harsh or unsympathetic. Moore's specific criticism that Ferguson's behavior showed a deadly combination of naivety and a fondness for the high life touches on something that has been a consistent theme throughout Ferguson's adult life. There has always been a sense that she is someone who is perhaps not as careful or considerate as she should be about the company she keeps and the sources of the money she accepts. Her attraction to wealthy and powerful people who can help maintain her lifestyle has repeatedly led her into situations that damage her reputation. The phrase Moore used about Ferguson's actions betraying Epstein's victims is particularly significant because it reframes the issue. It moves the conversation away from whether Ferguson made a personal mistake or showed poor judgment, and toward the question of what her behavior means for the people who are actually harmed by Epstein. This shift in perspective is important because it reminds everyone that this is not simply a story about a public figure facing career consequences. It is also a story about how society responds to serious crimes and whether people in positions of privilege and influence are held accountable when they enable or excuse such crimes, even indirectly. The comparison between Ferguson's current situation and her previous scandals is instructive. The toe-sucking incident was embarrassing and damaged her reputation, but it was essentially a personal matter that did not involve any allegations of illegal activity or harm to others. Her financial problems were certainly a cause for concern and reflected poorly on her judgment, but again, they were largely personal issues. The Epstein connection is different. It involves her association with someone who committed serious crimes against vulnerable people, and it involves her accepting benefits from that person even after his conviction. This is why the current scandal has proven so much more damaging than her previous controversies. There is a moral dimension to the Epstein connection that was not present in her earlier problems. It is one thing to be financially irresponsible or to have embarrassing photographs published. It is quite another to maintain a relationship with a convicted sex offender because he is willing to help pay your debts. The former might be forgivable as human weakness. The latter suggests a more troubling set of priorities. The impact on Prince Andrew has also been significant. Though he was already dealing with his own substantial problems related to Epstein, Andrew's association with Epstein has been far more extensive and more directly damaging than Ferguson's, and he has faced calls to be stripped of his remaining titles and completely excluded from public royal duties. The fact that Ferguson is also connected to Epstein, even if less directly, only adds to the pressure on King Charles to take decisive action regarding both of them. There are reports that Andrew may face eviction from Royal Lodge, the residence he has occupied for many years. The ongoing scrutiny of his Epstein connections has made his position increasingly untenable, and the revelations about Ferguson's email and financial relationship with Epstein have only intensified calls for the royal family to completely distance itself from both of them. For King Charles, who has spoken about his desire to streamline the monarchy and present a more modern, accountable institution, the continued presence of Andrew and Ferguson in the orbit of the royal family represents a significant problem. The implications of this scandal extend far beyond Sarah Ferguson's personal career troubles, or even the immediate embarrassment to the royal family. What we are witnessing is a moment that raises fundamental questions about accountability, privilege, and the ways in which powerful institutions respond when their members become entangled with serious criminal activity. The ripple effects of Ferguson's connection to Jeffrey Epstein touch on issues that matter to how society functions and what standards we hold public figures to, particularly those associated with institutions like the British monarchy. For King Charles, the situation presents a particularly difficult challenge. Since ascending to the throne, he has made clear his intention to modernize the monarchy and make it more relevant to contemporary British society. This has involved discussions about reducing the number of working royals, being more transparent about royal finances, and generally projecting an image of an institution that understands it must earn public support rather than simply expect it as a birthright. The concept of a slimmed-down monarchy has been central to Charles's vision, with the idea being that fewer royals receiving public funding and fewer people trading on their royal connections would make the institution more defensible and more in tune with modern values. However, this vision becomes much harder to realize when figures like Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson continue to be associated with the royal family despite their connections to one of the most notorious criminals of recent decades. Andrew may no longer be a working royal, and Ferguson was never technically part of the official royal family after her divorce, but both remain closely connected to the institution through their daughters and through their continued presence at certain family events. Every new revelation about their connection to Epstein undermines the image Charles is trying to project. The challenge is compounded by the fact that Beatrice and Eugenie, the daughters of Andrew and Ferguson, are by all accounts well regarded and have not been personally involved in any scandals. They maintain relationships with both their parents, as would be expected, and it would be difficult and perhaps unfair to completely exclude Andrew and Ferguson from family life because of the embarrassment they cause. Yet their continued presence, even in a private capacity, creates ongoing problems for the monarchy's public image. Critics of the royal family have argued for years that the institution represents an outdated form of privilege that has no place in a modern democracy. These critics point to cases like the Epstein scandal as evidence that royals and those connected to them operate by different rules than ordinary citizens. The fact that Andrew has faced no legal consequences for his association with Epstein, despite various allegations and the infamous interview he gave to the BBC in which he attempted to explain his friendship with Epstein, fuels the perception that wealthy and powerful people can escape accountability in ways that others cannot. Ferguson's situation, while different in some respects, feeds into the same narrative. She accepted money from a convicted sex offender, wrote to him in warm and appreciative terms, and apologized for publicly distancing herself from him, all while maintaining her connections to the royal family and enjoying the social status that came with being the Duchess of York. For many observers, this looks like another example of privilege, insulating people from the consequences of poor judgment and questionable moral choices. The entertainment industry's response to the Ferguson scandal has been swift and unambiguous. ITV's decision to cut all ties with her reflects a calculation that has become increasingly common in recent years, as public awareness of issues like sexual exploitation and abuse has grown. Networks and production companies have become much more sensitive to the reputational risks associated with working with controversial figures. The backlash that can result from being seen to provide a platform to someone connected to serious scandals can be severe and can affect not just ratings but also relationships with advertisers, regulators, and the broader public. This represents a significant shift from how such situations might have been handled in the past. There was a time when a figure like Ferguson, with her royal connections and her ability to attract viewers, might have been given the benefit of the doubt or allowed to weather the storm with a carefully crafted apology and a period of lying low. But the current climate, shaped in part by movements like Me Too and by a general increase in demands for accountability from powerful institutions and individuals, has made that kind of rehabilitation much more difficult. Other broadcasters and media companies will certainly be watching ITV's decision and drawing their own conclusions. It seems highly unlikely that any major British network would be willing to work with Ferguson in the foreseeable future. The risk of public criticism and the potential damage to their brand would simply be too great. This effectively means that Ferguson's career in television, which had been a significant part of her professional life and her income in recent years, is over. The same logic likely applies to many of her other professional ventures. Publishers may be reluctant to work with her on future books. Organizations may think twice about inviting her to speak at events or serve as an ambassador for their causes. The Epstein connection has made her toxic in a way that her previous scandals never quite did. While she survived the toe-sucking incident and the financial troubles and the various other embarrassments of her past, this scandal appears to be different in kind and more difficult to recover from. There is also the question of what this means for public discourse about victims of sexual abuse and exploitation. When high-profile figures like Ferguson are seen to have maintained relationships with perpetrators of such crimes, it can send a discouraging message to victims. It can reinforce the perception that powerful people will always be able to find others willing to overlook or excuse their behavior, as long as they have money or influence to offer. The fact that Ferguson apparently valued Epstein's financial support more than she valued taking a clear moral stand against his crimes is something that many victims of abuse will find deeply troubling. Jane Moore's comment about Ferguson betraying Epstein's victims captures this dimension of the issue effectively. It is not just that Ferguson made a poor choice or showed bad judgment. It is that her choice to maintain her relationship with Epstein, to accept his money, and to write to him warmly had implications for how Epstein's crimes were perceived and for how his victims were treated. By continuing to treat Epstein as a friend and benefactor worth apologizing to, Ferguson was in effect minimizing the seriousness of what he had done. The question of whether Ferguson deserves sympathy or whether she is being unfairly punished is one that divides opinion. Some argue that she made mistakes years ago, that she has acknowledged those mistakes, and that the current level of condemnation is disproportionate. They point out that she was not directly involved in any of Epstein's crimes and that her connection to him was primarily financial. They suggest that she was in a desperate situation because of her debts and made a choice that, while regrettable, is understandable given her circumstances. Others, however, argue that Ferguson's financial desperation does not excuse her choices. They point out that many people face financial difficulties without accepting money from convicted sex offenders. They argue that her willingness to overlook Epstein's crimes because he was willing to help her suggests a fundamental moral failing that goes beyond simple poor judgment. They contend that her position of privilege, her royal connections, and her public platform all gave her a responsibility to maintain higher standards than she did. The reality is probably somewhere between these two perspectives. Ferguson is neither a monster nor a helpless victim of circumstances. She is someone who made choices that reflected her priorities at the time, and those priorities apparently included maintaining access to money and social connections, even when doing so required her to maintain a relationship with someone who had committed serious crimes. Whether that makes her deserving of complete professional exile, or whether she should eventually be given an opportunity to rehabilitate her reputation, is a question that reasonable people can disagree about. What seems clear is that in the current climate, Ferguson will have a very difficult time finding a path back to public life. The combination of the Epstein connection, the hypocrisy revealed in her private communications versus her public statements, and the broader context of increased scrutiny of how powerful people and institutions handle allegations of abuse and exploitation, has created an environment in which forgiveness or rehabilitation will be extremely challenging. For the context, royal family, the Ferguson scandal is yet another reminder of how difficult it is to control the narrative around the institution when individual members or those closely associated with them make choices that conflict with the values the monarchy claims to represent. King Charles can talk about modernization and accountability all he wants, but as long as people connected to the royal family are seen to have benefited from relationships with criminals, like Epstein, those words will ring hollow to many observers. The broader lesson from this situation may be about the limits of privilege and the ways in which public tolerance for questionable behavior by powerful people has shifted. There was perhaps a time when someone in Ferguson's position could have weathered this storm, offered a carefully worded statement of regret, and eventually resumed something approximating a normal public life. That time appears to have passed. The current environment demands more accountability and is less willing to overlook behavior that suggests a lack of basic moral judgment, particularly when that behavior involves association with individuals who have caused serious harm to vulnerable people.